So I think Donald Trump was the perfect candidate for the FIFA Peace Prize, a made-up participation trophy that turned him into an international laughingstock. Like literally, people online holding up their Burger King or Chipotle peace prizes in response. And that's because this whole idea of him as the peace president is one of the dumbest and sickest jokes in modern American history. After all, this is the guy who has a secret police force brutalizing and murdering people in the streets, whether it's undocumented immigrants just trying to get through the system, legal residents or American citizens who get caught up in these overly aggressive ICE raids, or American citizens just doing the most American thing you can do with protesting this government. And that's just at home. Looking abroad, the America First crowd is suddenly more than happy to engage in any kind of foreign intervention. Billions to Israel to fund airstrikes after a fake ceasefire. Billions more to run Venezuela in what has to be the most expensive oil rig in American history. And countless other interventions likely to come, whether that's Iran, Greenland, and Cuba, because of course conquest and regime change have just worked out so great in American history before. That's the Peace Prize, President, ladies and gentlemen, and that's what we're getting into in today's episode. So welcome, I'm your host, Rich Kim of Left and Loose, and this is the show where I call out Republican and MAGA bullshit. Before we get into the episode, I just have two disclaimers that I want to get into first. The first is, I started the show about 4 months ago, so that's a great achievement. That things so far have gone pretty well. As you probably noticed, though, this started out with the idea of it being a weekly series, and in more recent weeks/months, that's become less so the case, while I've been more focused on social media, in particular Instagram, where I'm getting traction for, to be honest, a good amount of work, but less work than putting together these longer form episodes. But I'm still super dedicated to this podcast. I'm just viewing it as more of a longer term project, and one that I will be working on a sort of semi-regular basis rather than weekly. And so that's my long way of saying that these episodes will probably come out every few weeks. And I really appreciate you guys continuing to bear with me on YouTube, podcasts, and Substack. And I'll be sure to let you know when I come back to this show and make it more of a weekly cadence. Second is, I'm recording this after the invasion of Venezuela and after the killing of Renee Good, basically in the midst of the subsequent crackdown of ICE in Minnesota and the response from protesters to that. And of course, though, by the time that this episode comes out, knowing the daily fresh hells that confront us politically in Trump 2.0, there may be and probably will be, even further crazy news. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if there was suddenly some operation in Iran, basically when this episode comes out. And for any of that further news though, this episode will absolutely help you to understand these things, whether at home or abroad. So please check it out and continue to follow me on Instagram and TikTok for more live updates. Now getting into the show. So it's so funny looking at this idea of the peace president or Donald the Dove during Trump 2.0, especially the direction where things are headed. Basically, we have a fascist military takeover in our streets and renewed conflicts abroad. And it's just funny thinking about where all this came from, that most Americans at least claimed to be so tired of all of this blood and money that has gone into the military-industrial complex in America to create a huge police state and to fund decades of foreign wars that have cost countless lives in Iraq and Afghanistan, have affected the lives of military veterans who have the ones who have at least come home in one piece, if that, and the burden of all Americans who have had to live large portions of our lives with a country at war. Like Lockheed Martin has done great at this time, but not everyone else. And of course, all of this goes back to George W. Bush. He's the one who, in response to 9/11, passed the Patriot Act, which resulted in the police state being kicked into high gear, which it never came down from. He started the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in the case of Iraq, made up a completely fake pretext to invade this country, and when it was really likely just for toppling a dictator and taking oil, which now sounds chillingly familiar. And to be fair, the presidents subsequent to George W. Bush continued this effort, surging troops, conducting drone strikes, until Biden pulled us out of Afghanistan, as disastrous and catastrophic as that was. So you could see the desire for when Trump, the candidate, in 2024 came back into the picture and said he's going to be the peace president, that it's America first. No more meddling abroad, no more foreign interventions. He just wants to make sure that Americans are doing well. You can see how much of a sick joke actually that is now, right? And the sad part is that the MAGA base actually believes a lot of this stuff, or at least says that they do. I think that a lot of these MAGA people are starting to have their doubts, but they'll point to, for example, the Israel ceasefire or the 7 other wars he supposedly solved, when the real number for all 8 of these is 0. And to be fair, I think he's owed some credit for the release of the last hostages, certainly some more than Biden, who also negotiated some hostage release. But beyond that, when you really dig into any of these supposed wars that he solved, and especially when you look at what's going on now, both at home and abroad, you can see that this whole peace president thing is basically a crock of shit. That it's a marketing scheme like the FIFA Peace Prize that can be just repeated and vomited out by people like J.D. Vance and Caroline Leavitt to cover for a president who's waging a number of smaller scale wars, but just calling it something different, like immigration enforcement or a law enforcement operation in Venezuela, or basically any further made-up story that we're likely to see with these further foreign interventions. And it's important to remember that all of this is basically stacked on a house of cards, that the second anything remotely goes wrong in one of these complicated countries that we're staging interventions in now, then this boils over into a full-scale war, right? I mean, we can already see this sort of brimming over into an actual almost civil war here at home, let alone what would happen abroad. So here's the framework for today's episode. It's first, we're going to focus on what's going on at home with, in particular, this ICE operation in Minnesota, the killing of Renee Good, and the subsequent response to that. Second, we're going to focus on Venezuela and the operation there and what's likely to come there in other countries. And third, basically going to debunk the whole Israel and 7 other wars that have been quote unquote solved. And it's all to show that this whole idea of the quote unquote peace president is complete bullshit. So first, this ICE operation in Minnesota, this deployment there. I think it's important to remember where this came from. That supposedly ICE's mission from the beginning was supposed to be about violent criminals. So you could imagine a world, right, where ICE was just focused on getting violent criminals deported out of the country, which would make a lot of sense. And they just did that across the entire country. They were just spreading out officers, agents everywhere in order to focus on that singular effort. But of course, we know that's not what they're doing. It's the opposite. That Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem and others in the administration want ICE to deport as many people as possible, regardless of whether or not they have valid claims to be here. They want them brutalized, arrested, and ideally deported as quickly as possible. And so what's happening is, in addition to that, is that that Trump is deploying these ICE agents in cities that he doesn't like, that he's picking and choosing and saying, okay, these cities that are blue cities that haven't voted for me, I'm going to surge ICE agents into there and basically terrorize them just because he doesn't like these, right? He specifically chooses places like Chicago, Minneapolis, Charlotte, wherever, just to basically cause issues in these places. And that's the backdrop of what was happening in Minneapolis. On top of that, there was this idea that Somali Americans in Minneapolis have been committing like pandemic fraud. This is an item that certain Somali Americans have been prosecuted for already, and that there are ongoing investigations on by the FBI. In addition, there was a fake documentary, basically a documentary that has been entirely disproven, about some fraud with Somali American run daycares. You're noticing, right, a pattern already, though. I'm saying Somali American. These are people who are already American citizens. So even if there was an ongoing issue here, this is not an area for ICE to be involved, right? Because it's supposed to be just about immigration enforcement. And ICE is also not the people responsible for investigating fraud. That's something for the FBI. So, but like with many things in this administration, this is being used as a pretext to stage like a PR stunt where you can make a big show of it and have this big show of force and basically cause issues in cities or states that you don't like. Now, with this as the backdrop, of course, when there are these ICE agent deployments, there are going to be protesters, right? And that was more or less who Renee Good was. And she and her wife were there in their neighborhood as legal observers, meaning that they were there to document and to call out ICE activities or to advise people of their rights in these situations. And that is entirely their First Amendment rights to do so, to exercise their free speech and to protest in this particular form. Now, ICE agents will say, and ICE will say, well, they were obstructing law enforcement because this vehicle was blocking the road or whatever, that just because they were around, which I imagine is it's very inconvenient, right? When American citizens are present and exercise their First Amendment rights. It's very inconvenient for operations. And we all know what happened for there. We've all seen the videos, so we're aware of basically how this ICE agent then killed Renee Good. On that, though, I'm just going to say these three things that shows that the ICE agent, Jonathan Ross, who was involved there, was wrong in what he did. First, he put himself on the front left side of the vehicle. It's basically law enforcement 101 that you don't do that you don't put that in a situation. That's what countless law enforcement officers have been saying subsequent to this. Second is he had his gun out, which you got to ask yourself, these are clearly unarmed women getting back into their car, and for whatever reason, he has his gun out too to point at them. And it's this choice to be overly aggressive. to point at them and order them out of the vehicle. Like, there's no law enforcement stop where this would otherwise be okay. Like if you or I were stopped, right, by a random cop, for that cop to suddenly pull out a gun on you and to say, hey, you know, get out of the vehicle when, you know, when you don't have any danger that you're posing. Third is he clearly sidestepped from the vehicle. As the vehicle was clearly turning away, which we've seen in multiple video angles, including the video from Jonathan Ross himself. As the vehicle was turning away, he sidestepped, moved out of the way, and was out of harm's way from this vehicle that was slowly pulling away, and he still shot her. He made the emotional decision, whether it was out of anger from them even being there, surprise that they were even driving away, or fear because he'd been in a previous vehicle accident months prior to this, that he made the choice to kill her. And after he executed her, he called her a fucking bitch. Now, it would be one thing if the administration had responded to this by saying, we, despite what the videos are showing, still think that this ICE agent was defending himself, but we will let an investigation play out, and in the meantime, we will conduct ICE operations to a high caliber degree to make sure that this sort of thing just does not happen going forward. That would be the path of peace, of de-escalation, trying to make the minimum effort to preserve peace in this city. But as we all know, they've chosen the opposite. They've called Renee Good and her wife terrorists. They've, instead of initiating investigations on Jonathan Ross and what most of the people who see these videos actually see, they are investigating Renee Good's wife for connection to domestic terrorism, which is just so gruesome. It's unbelievable. In addition, they're saying the ICE officer did nothing wrong, not even admitting that as a possibility, regardless of what we've all seen. They are surging ICE agents into Minneapolis. They are deploying even more brutal tactics, knocking doors down to conduct these overly aggressive raids, and even stopping people and asking people for their papers like a secret police Gestapo force would. And suddenly the cosplaying fascist clowns come out. So there's Kristi Noem standing up at a podium with a Nazi slogan saying, "One of us, all of you," which is chilling, right? And you have Greg Bovino, a head of ICE, walking around in a uniform that looks a lot like a Nazi general. So the administration is clearly sending a signal to protesters in Minneapolis who have responded to the execution of Renee Good, saying that any resistance to what this regime is doing is going to be met with brutal force. But the silver lining in all of this is that the people in Minneapolis, and so many people flocking to support them, whether it's online or in person, are not backing down from this regime, and that all of these images and videos from this brutal crackdown in Minneapolis is turning public opinion against certainly ICE, which is clearly becoming a Gestapo-like police force operating outside of normal law enforcement. Now, that's just the war brewing at home. Of course, we've got the wars brewing abroad, and for that, the main example that comes to mind is Venezuela. With Venezuela as well, again, there is this fake pretext that was being used in order to conduct this invasion of another country. That it was, the drugs are the problem. That Nicolas Maduro and his government are narco-terrorists. Never mind the fact that actually zero fentanyl is produced in Venezuela, And close to zero cocaine is also being produced in Venezuela. And also, never mind the fact that Trump has actually pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was serving time in the States for drug trafficking, in particular, 400 tons of cocaine that he was sending to the US. But I guess this Honduran president just had the right kind of connections, right? And so they have this pretext around narco terrorists. And they use that pretext to deploy this military force in the Caribbean and to police the Venezuelan shores. And of course, while they're at it, they're also conducting war crimes as well. So they have war bombers made to look like civilian airplanes conducting attacks on these fishing boats. They have strikes that they're conducting on shipwrecked survivors of these boats. Of course, just so nobody can live to tell the tale of what was actually going on with any of these. Because, by the way, the strikes of these boats are completely extrajudicial with no proof that there were actually any drug traffickers involved. So from there, again, we know how the story goes, right? Trump orders this military operation to remove Nicolas Maduro and to bring him to the States. And you would not believe, or maybe you've seen, all of these MAGA people just cheering and pointing to these videos of Venezuelans celebrating in the streets, whether it was AI generated or not, by the way. But that's another episode. And saying, oh, that Trump has liberated the people of Venezuela. Of course, we find out shortly thereafter that actually the Maduro regime is still in place, just without Maduro. Instead, it's his vice president. And we're going to just be leeching off them for oil for at least the next 18 months. I wonder if it might be a little bit more than that. Now, don't get me wrong. Maduro was a piece of shit dictator, and it's good that he's out. But that's where basically any sort of sense around this stops. Like, even putting aside that this is the opposite of America First, this is basically the most expensive possible way to get oil from another country. That's what now has come out through all of this, that this has basically just been about the oil. The U.S. is a net exporter of oil and natural gas. And we have probably a million other cheaper ways to get to oil rather than to have our military conduct this operation specifically just so oil companies can have some more access to now the Venezuela reserves, which, by the way, will also take years and billions of dollars to develop the infrastructure to even access more of these reserves. And in the meantime, we also have the military trying to run a country that is now basically hanging on by a thread, that has various paramilitary forces, that has factions of the government that are not, in all likelihood, so happy with American forces coming in, stealing their resources and running their country. And you can see how this situation starts to look a lot like the other conflicts that we've been in, right? Basically, American troops and American military assets that are anywhere near this place have a huge target on their back. And it's just a matter of time before people actually start trying to hit these targets. And that's where we end up in a real actual war at some point soon. And this is really just the start, right? Because now Trump has gotten a little hit of that like conquest crack pipe. And he's now talking already about what if he's going to strike Iran while this regime is weakened? Or what if he's going to take some action against Greenland to take them over yeah, for their natural resources, or Cuba because Marco Rubio and Stephen Miller are whispering sweet regime change nothings into his old, demented stroke victim ears. That's the thing. This is the guy who feels like he can basically get away with anything without consequences. So, what's to stop him from going to another one of these places and conducting further operations? And again, even putting aside that none of this is America first, you could at least make some arguments for a place like Iran, right? Where we would be trying to topple a regime that has been a brutal and terrible regime that has oppressed its people and also financed so much terrorism in the world through all these different proxy groups. But that's the thing with these people. They're good, or they'll do the job just like the US has done for decades at toppling regimes on day one, but there's never an actual plan for day two. A realistic plan in terms of how these countries are then going to be set on their own independent course without inevitable US involvement. That's why all of these regime change operations end up being so much more terrible in the long run than they look like at the outset. Like, these clowns can't even run America without the country being close to a near economic collapse and militarized chaos on the streets. How are they going to have any possible plan for running another country while they're at it? Okay, and so now, lastly and very quickly, turning to the 8 wars that Trump has supposedly solved. The main example there is Israel. And like I was saying at the top of the episode, Trump and his administration deserve some credit for negotiating the last of these hostage releases. That's absolutely true. But then looking at the actual ceasefire and beyond that, objectively, not much has been accomplished because it's basically turned a full-scale war into a slow-boil one. So since the ceasefire, there have been hundreds of airstrikes by Israel on Palestinian people, killing a lot of Palestinian people in the process, and which has, by the way, been financed by the US in large part. There have been continued restrictions on aid going into Gaza, which has led to continual starvation issues. Palestinians in Gaza are still living in tents in a lot of instances, freezing and dying from the horrible conditions there. So if anything, it really looks like Benjamin Netanyahu looks like the smartest person in the room because he can say on paper that there's been a ceasefire while he's actually instituting an Israel militarized police state in Palestine, in Gaza, and the West Bank, and is still conducting basically a lower scale war while they're at it too. So this is where basically this whole FIFA Peace Prize marketing thing comes into play, because Trump and J.D. Vance and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff can all smile for the cameras when in actuality there is still an ongoing war and conflict there at the same time, led by Benjamin Netanyahu and paid for by the US. And for the 7 other wars that Trump has supposedly solved, quote unquote, these can basically fall into 3 categories. The first category is a conflict where one side clearly won and the other side just surrendered. That would be Azerbaijan and Armenia over this territory that they were fighting a war over. Azerbaijan won that conflict and that was it. Second is a conflict where both sides just agreed on a ceasefire on their own, which was like, for example, India and Pakistan, where the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, said the US had nothing to do with this. Or third is where there's still a conflict that's ongoing, like in, for example, Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where basically they will say that there's a ceasefire there, and Trump will, plant the flag and declare victory. But hours later, after saying that at the White House, people are dying on both sides, right, from the ongoing war that's still happening there. So you could see how then this is the FIFA Peace Prize for this really is perfect, because that's what the administration is doing in each of these instances. They're just declaring victory for the minimum effort that they put in to basically have no role in resolving these conflicts, but for Trump to pretend like he's the big man in the room, and the MAGA administration and all of these MAGA sheep followers fall in line, and by all means, guys, enjoy your participation trophy in that respect. So this is the whole episode when it comes to it, right? You guys get what I'm saying here, that this whole peace president thing is just a complete marketing scam. And people have made so many comparisons between the Trump administration and Orwell's 1984, which I agree with completely in a lot of ways. But at least in 1984, Big Brother had the just honesty to call a war, as opposed to what we're currently seeing, which is a lot of smaller scale wars, whether it's at home or abroad, just being called other things. And that makes sense, right? In this type of administration, which is so focused on these marketing scam jobs. But that's the thing, right? That marketing scams can only spin these stories so much that people are already saying, hey, this ICE force that you have cracking down on good people in our streets all across this country looks a whole lot like the Gestapo. The America First crowd is saying, what the fuck are we doing in Venezuela? Why are we now running this country? And so people are slowly waking up to what the agenda of this administration actually seems to be, whether it's with what we've seen so far or what's going to be happening in the next 3 years that we still have with this government. And that is, at the end of the day, the war agenda. So guys, cheers to you. We need to call this out for what this is every single day and wherever we possibly can. And I will be seeing you when I see you.